My name is Grace. I'm 34 years old, and I teach English at a high school in Portland, Oregon. I've been teaching for 9 years. One of the things I teach my students is how to read carefully, not just what the words say, but what they're being asked to assume. I want to tell you about the 16 months I spent waiting for a man named James to finish getting divorced, and about the day I found out he had never started. I want to start in the middle, because that's where the understanding arrived. 16 months in, a Tuesday evening in October, James sitting across from me at my kitchen table, telling me in a voice I recognized as his explaining voice, calm and reasonable, that the divorce had been more complicated than expected, that the lawyer had run into some delays, that it would just be a little longer. And me looking at him and thinking, for the first time clearly, he has been saying this since February. I met James in February 18 months ago. A mutual friend introduced us at a gallery opening. He told me on our first real date, up front, which I respected, that he was in the process of getting divorced. He and his wife had been separated for 8 months, he said. They had agreed it was over. The paperwork was just a formality at this point. He was clear about it, honest, I thought. This is someone who knows what he wants and is handling it properly. I thought that was character. I was careful. I want to be clear about that. I told myself, give it time, don't rush, let the situation resolve before you invest fully. I didn't meet his friends for the first 2 months. I didn't push to know the details of the divorce. I didn't ask questions. That I thought might feel like pressure. I believed, being mature about a complicated situation. I told my friends, he's handling it, I can wait. The irony is that my carefulness was exactly what made the lie so sustainable. The reasons evolved over the 16 months. They were always plausible, always specific enough to be believable. Month 3, the lawyer had a scheduling conflict. Month 5, they were negotiating the house. Month 8, his wife had become difficult. Month 11, her mother had fallen ill, and it felt inhumane to push right now. Month 14, the lawyer had changed firms. Each reason was reasonable. Each reason replaced the last. And I said, okay, I understand, I can wait. I want to be honest about this part. James was good to me within the relationship we had. He was present, attentive, funny in the specific way that only works with certain people. He knew when I needed to talk and when I needed silence. He cooked dinner on Sunday nights. Within what he gave me, he was genuine. That's the thing about this kind of lie. It doesn't require the person to be cold or careless. It only requires them to be very good at deciding what you're allowed to have. At month 12, something shifted in me quietly. I didn't say anything, but I started counting, not aggressively, just noticing. 12 months since he said it would be a formality. 12 months of reasons, each one arriving just before I would have had to say something. I told myself, this is what divorces are like. He is not lying to you. I told myself that very carefully, because some part of me already knew that careful telling is what you do when you're not entirely sure. By month 14, I had stopped telling people James and I were together, not because I was ashamed, because every time I mentioned him, someone would ask how the divorce was going, and I would have to give another vague answer. I was tired of my own vague answers. I had started to hear in them the shape of someone who doesn't actually know, not because the information is being withheld, but because the question has stopped being asked. I had stopped asking because I was afraid of the answer. In month 15, I asked to see the paperwork. I said it plainly without drama. I said, I need to see the divorce filing, just the initial petition, the proof that it was filed. He looked at me in a way I hadn't seen from him before. Not guilty, exactly, more like recalibrating. He said he didn't have it with him, that it was at his lawyer's office. I said, can you get it? He said he would. He didn't get it that week. He didn't get it the week after. And by the third week, I knew. I lived with that knowing for 3 weeks before I said it out loud. I went to work, I graded papers, I made lesson plans. There's a particular loneliness in knowing something you're not yet ready to make real, because once you say it, the conversation has to happen and the relationship ends. And I had loved this person for 16 months, and I wasn't ready, and then I was. On a Tuesday evening in October, month 16, I sat James down and I asked him directly. I said, have you filed for divorce? Not, how is divorce going? Not, any news on the paperwork? Just, have you filed? He was quiet for a long moment. He said, it's been complicated. I said, that's not what I asked. Another silence. And then he said, no. One word, short and without decoration. No. I said, have you ever filed at any point in the last 16 months? He said, no. I said, are you actually separated from her? He took a long time. He said, it's complicated. I said, James, are you living with your wife? He said, we're in the same house, but we've been... I said, stop, because I didn't need the rest of the sentence. The sentence I needed had already ended. He explained, I sat and let him. He said he had meant to file, that it had been his intention from the beginning, that meeting me had made him want to finally do it, that he was scared, that leaving a 12-year marriage was harder than he'd expected, that his wife didn't know about me. He said he loved me. I listened to all of it, and I thought every one of these things might be true, and none of them change what 16 months of waiting actually was. What I said to him was this. I said, I didn't ask you to leave her on the first date. I didn't ask you to have it sorted by month 3. I told you I could wait, and I meant it. I said, what I asked for was honesty about where things actually were. I said, you had 16 chances, 16 months, Junior, to tell me the truth, and every month you chose the reason instead. He said, I know. I said, I know you know. And then I asked him to leave, and he did. I sat in the kitchen for a long time after he left, not with anger yet, that came later, with something closer to bewilderment. How had I let this go so long? I'm a person who teaches students to read carefully, to ask, what is this text asking me to assume? And I had not read this clearly. I had read it the way you read something you want to be true. That is not a small thing to sit with. His wife's name is Patricia. Patricia did not know about me. I'm certain of that. She was living in a house with a husband who had told her, presumably, some other version of where he was on the evenings and weekends he spent in my apartment. I think about her sometimes. Not with guilt, I didn't know, but with something. She spent 16 months being lied to too. We just weren't told the same lies. The question I sat with the longest was this: why didn't I ask sooner? I had a list of reasonable answers, didn't want to pressure him, understood that divorce is complicated. But underneath all of those reasonable answers was something less comfortable. I didn't ask because I was afraid of what the asking might end. And what I hadn't noticed was that in deciding that, I had handed him the permission to keep the uncertainty going indefinitely. My patience was real, but it had also been useful to him in a way I hadn't authorized. I called my friend Mara that night. We talked for 2 hours. She said I wondered. I never wanted to say it. I said, why didn't you? She said, because you seemed happy. And I wasn't sure, and it wasn't my place. I thought about that for a long time, how the people who love us often hold back the things they notice because they're afraid of being wrong, and how the people who are lying to us are counting, not consciously maybe, but counting on exactly that. James called me 3 times over the next week. I didn't answer. He texted once, I need you to know I'm going to fix this. I read it and I thought, I've heard that sentence before, in different words, for 16 months. I didn't respond, not out of cruelty, out of clarity. There are moments when someone has told you everything you need to know, and any further conversation is just an opportunity for the story to become complicated again. I didn't want the story to become complicated again. It's been 3 months now, month 17 if I'm still counting, and I'm trying to stop. Portland in winter is grey and quiet, and very good for being alone with your thoughts. I go to the bookshop on Saturday mornings. I grade papers on Sunday afternoons. I've started running again, which I'd stopped doing somewhere around month 8 without noticing. I am cautiously okay. Not unscathed, but okay. There's a difference between those two things that I've had to learn to hold separately. A student asked me last week, we were discussing an unreliable narrator. She asked, Miss, how do you know when someone's lying in a story? I said, look at what they keep deferring, the thing that never quite arrives, the answer that stays just out of reach. She wrote it down, and I thought, I'm going to make sure they learn this better than I did. Not because I was foolish, because the lesson was available all along, and I wasn't quite reading for it. What James did has a name in psychology, rationalization. Not lying in the simple sense, but living inside a story about your own intentions that protects you from having to act on them. He intended to file. He believed himself when he said it. He just also never did it. And the gap between intending and doing, sustained over 16 months, becomes its own kind of deception. Not because the feeling was false, because the feeling was being used as a substitute for the action, and I was the one living inside the gap. I want to say something to anyone who has been in a version of this, the I'm separated situation, the we're basically done, just working out details. These phrases work precisely because they are close enough to the truth to be believable, and they place the person hearing them in an impossible position. If you push back, you look impatient or insecure. If you wait, you might wait 16 months. There's no clean answer to that trap. I just want you to know it's a trap. Here is what I don't regret. I don't regret being patient. I don't regret believing that a difficult situation deserves time. I don't regret loving him. What I learned was the difference between patience that is generous and patience that becomes permission. Generous patience says, I understand this is complicated and I'll give you room. Permission says, I'll keep waiting regardless of what you do or don't do. I crossed that line somewhere around month 10. I just didn't see it at the time. I want to ask you something I've been thinking about since October. How long is long enough to wait for someone? Who says they are in the process of becoming available? I genuinely don't know the right answer. For some people, the wait is worth it. Sometimes the situation is real and the timing is just hard. What I know now is that for me, the number wasn't 16 months. I think it was probably somewhere around 6. And I wish I had known that before I started counting. What would your number be? I'd like to know. I'm still in Portland, still teaching. I assigned a new novel this semester, one where the narrator is honest about being unreliable, which is its own kind of gift to the reader. I told my class the most dangerous narrators aren't the ones who lie, they're the ones who genuinely believe what they're saying. A student said, how do you protect yourself from that? I said, you ask for evidence, not because you distrust people, but because trust without evidence is just hope. And hope is not a plan. She wrote that down too. Before you go, if you have been the person waiting for someone to become available, to finish what they said they were finishing, to finally choose you openly, I want to say one thing. Waiting for someone is not the same as being chosen by them. Waiting is something you do. Being chosen is something they do. And if the choosing keeps being deferred, if there is always one more reason, one more month, that deferral is itself an answer. It's just not the one they're saying out loud. You deserve someone for whom choosing you is not the thing they're getting around to. You deserve to be the thing they already did.